The Influencer's Edge is brought to you by the Rapid Sales Accelerator. If you're ready to skyrocket your sales by 30% or more in just 90 days, then you need to claim your free training right now. You'll learn 4 words that will compel your prospects to trust you like they were children within the first 3 to 5 minutes of any conversation across any platform and any medium. You'll learn how to give your prospects objection amnesia, to crush objections like, I need to talk to my spouse, or I need more time to think it over, or it's too expensive. If you'd like to claim your free training now, go to www.paulrossbook.com. Do it before your competition does it now. Thank you for tuning in to the Influencer's Edge, where you get the latest breakthroughs, cutting-edge insights, tools, and techniques so you can leapfrog over the pack in sales, influence, and persuasion. Remember to visit our website at www.theinfluencersedge.com to enjoy even more great episodes like this one. We look forward to seeing you again on the Influencer's Edge Show.
Welcome to the Influencer's Edge, the show that colors outside the lines, disconnects the dots, and thinks outside the box. Well, today's guest talks with an accent, which I always think makes for a more interesting interview. His name is Dave McCullough. Is that how you pronounce it?
No, it's McCaughan.
Oh, what the hell do I know? Sorry, McCaughan. That's right.
Yeah.
I'm punch drunk today. I didn't get enough sleep last night, but that's fine. We'll do a great job. So you are from the land down under, Australia.
I am originally, yes.
Right. Well, we all love Australia, famous for Ruse, Vegemite, and Steve Irwin. May his soul rest in peace. So today we're talking about branding in Asia. We've never talked to anyone who specializes in doing business in Asia. So we'll get to that. But I tell my guests, Dave, that I seldom read through the biography all the way through, but because the listeners don't stay on to hear it. And also, usually there's something in the biography that so catches my attention. We talk about that for half the episode, if not the whole thing. So you've spent 40 years helping brands find and tell their story across the Asia Pacific region. Obviously, you got to Asia, I'm assuming, because you're from the Pacific, Asia Pacific. Is Australia considered Asia Pacific?
Yeah, well,
its own continent.
To be honest with you, Paul, I think back home in Australia, it's still a bit of a divided issue as to whether Australia counts itself as part of Asia or not. But yeah, we're Asia Pacific. And the truth is, I moved to Asia 30 years ago because I got transferred. I was working for a big American company, the Australian offices, and I got transferred for maybe 2 years, and 30 years later, I'm still living in Asia. So, that's life sometimes, right?
Cool. All right. So you've worked for tiny little, virtually unknown brands, creating brand stories for Coca-Cola, Nescafe. I don't know who they are. MasterCard beats me. You lived in Bangkok, Hong Kong, Shanghai, Tokyo. Which of those cities did you find was most welcoming to you, had the most warm culture? I ask because I visited all over Europe, and the people who I found to be the coldest in public, the Swedes and the Norwegians, were actually very friendly. Once they opened their homes to you, they rolled out the carpets. All those cultures, which was actually the warmest in public?
Well, I have to say, because I live now in Bangkok, and this is the second time I've lived in Bangkok. So first time 5 years, this time 10 years. But I have to say that my wife and I we fell in love with living in Japan. And I found it very interestingly, a lot of Westerners, Americans, Australians, Brits, Europeans, when they go to work in Japan, they find it hard because both the general culture, but also the business culture is very, very different from a Western or American approach. But I just genuinely fell in love with it right from the beginning. I sort of clicked into the way it worked, the way things are done. And the other thing is, of course, that, there's a sort of perception that, well, Japanese people are very formal. They don't talk to strangers, et cetera, et cetera. But the truth is that it doesn't take much effort to get Japanese people to like you, to work with you, to become friends. I have to say, like, it's now 12 years since we left Japan. And I can honestly say, if you asked my wife to write down her 5 best friends in the world, 4 of them would be Japanese.
Wow.
Uh, we just found it was a great place. We lived there for 10 years, just loved it. But equally, the reason we're living in Thailand is purely by choice. It's not, originally I got transferred here, but this time we came back 10 years ago just because we like it. And it's a very comfortable, easy place to live. It's very, people are exceptionally friendly, very easygoing. Paul, when I first moved and started traveling a lot for business overseas, and I have to say I'm hopeless at languages, right? So I go around and say, look, I can't speak Thai, Japanese, Chinese, whatever. And people say, every country I've ever lived in, people would always say, well, there's one phrase you need to know, right? So the phrase for Thailand is Mai Pen Rai. And Mai Pen Rai basically means, it's okay, man. Don't worry about it.
Right. Next time I'm getting a massage and she's too rough, I'll say my pen right.
Right. And it's sort of interesting because, like, Japan, the phrase was basically the equivalent of sumimasen, which basically means I'm sorry, right? Please forgive me, right? So if you get to that, if you think about it, there's one phrase for every culture that you sort of need to know, because that's the phrase that gives you the guideline into the way the culture works, right?
So this brings up a point. I want to, this is what I told you and how I do these interviews or discussions. They're not even really interviews. This bears something in mind. When you're building a brand, say for, I don't know, name the company, it doesn't matter. The messaging is going to be different according to the culture that you're in. Is that correct or incorrect? Or do some brands transcend cultures? For example, if I could, I want to put this on the table. I remember going to Israel twice and seeing everybody wearing Nikes, including the Arabs and the Jews and the Druze and the Christians. They all wore Nikes.
Yeah.
So it was all similar there, despite a melting pot of cultures. But in more homogenous cultures that are so different from the West, do you have to consider telling a different story depending on the brand?
You have to consider telling the story. It's not about telling a different story. It's about telling the story differently. So there's the obvious things. When let's take MasterCard, right, which you sort of joked about, right? So when MasterCard relaunched back in 1998 with what became known as the Priceless campaign, and ran all those ads all the time that were sort of like, take your kid to the baseball, the hot dogs cost $10, the souvenir hat cap costs $20, the experience is priceless, right? The original ad for that campaign was shot in America. It was literally a dad taking his 10-year-old son to the baseball. Now, when we made that in India, you made exactly the same ad, but with cricket, right?
Right.
In New Zealand, you made exactly the same ad, but with rugby union, right? In Argentina, they made exactly the same ad with a soccer ball, going to a soccer match. So that's a pretty obvious way in which you translate the story into something more relevant, because, look, even in my home country, if you showed a baseball game, everybody goes, yeah, that's something Americans play. Who cares?
What is it? Cricket?
Cricket, right? We're one of the great cricket countries, right? So sometimes I have to explain to people, you have to think about that. You have to think about what examples you're going to use. But you also have to think about the way in which emotions are sometimes expressed. So to go back, Japan, for example, it's a bit more subdued, right? So yes, you will see, if you watched a reel of the 100 greatest ever Japanese TV commercials, you see it's hugely exaggerated, very physical, right? Now, that's actually part of, and much more so than you would see in the US today. Now, and you go, yeah, but I thought you just said Japan was sort of suppressed, emotionally. Well, it's more about the fact that people want the trick of actually being allowed to do something like that, so through the commercial. So it's not necessarily something you would do on the street yourself, but when you see it happening in the commercial, oh, that's fine, right?
I
And
imagine
then,
Korea would be completely different with
well,
K-pop.
Korea, yeah, Korea, because of, well, now we have the image of Korea, of K-pop, et cetera, right?
Yes.
So, you also have to take on board that cultures are changing. And of course, sometimes the culture that we see as an outsider is sometimes not what is represented inside the culture. And I'll give you a simple example of that. Many years ago, when I was still working and living in Australia, I had to do some work where we were trying to understand, we were representing some big American brands like Coca-Cola, Levi's, et cetera, in Australia, doing their advertising. And so I did some research where I was trying to understand teenagers in Australia. So what we would literally do is I would find a teenager, a typical sort of 15, 16-year-old, and say, hey, Paul, I'd ring you up and say, Paul, I heard that you're a pretty cool guy. Listen, I'd love to come and talk to you and a couple of your mates. Can you invite a couple of your best friends around to your house? And
Oh
I
my
go,
God, if you did that in America, you'd be on a show called To Catch a Predator.
well, maybe, right. But this is 30 years ago. But, one of the things was we would go into somebody's house, and I'd sit there maybe for 2 hours, and usually I try to get them to sit in their bedroom with their two mates, whatever, right? And you've got 2, 3, 4, 4 to 15-year-olds sitting around, and we're talking. I'm looking at the posters and saying, hey, how come you love that band? What is it about that music you like? Or right? But one of the exercises we used to do was we'd say, look, if you could be born again anywhere in the world, who and where would you like to be born? Right? Now, what was interesting was working class Australian kids 30 years ago consistently said, well, obviously, I want to be born as a Black American. And you go, oh, why would you want to be a Black American? They go, because they're the richest, most successful people in the world. Because because on television, all they saw was pop stars and
Right.
Michael Jordan, right?
Michael Jackson, Michael Jordan and
Michael
Michael Jackson.
Jackson, Michael Jordan, right? And so the perception was, well, they're all millionaire entertainers and sports people, right? And it must be the richest, luckiest people in the world. So you got to be careful. And so now, for example, in the last 10 years, we've seen this amazing increase in the perception of Korea through K-pop, and uh, Blackpink has become the most successful band in the world in the last few years, et cetera, et cetera. Well, I got to tell you, day to day, when you go to visit Seoul and you talk to normal people in Seoul, yes, that music's there, and if you're a young person, you might be listening to that music, but it's not exactly like Seoul has become like the pop capital of the world, right? It's a nice city. It's got some interesting things to do. It's got more coffee shops than you can imagine. But it's the perception outside sometimes compared to what's inside.
It seems to me, just looking at you and listening to your story and how you talk and what's required for your job, you must be a very, very good psychologist and someone. Listen, let me complete my statement here, my thought, because it's just coming to me now. What's arising for me now is you must have a driving interest in what makes people tick. And here's my question for you. How did that first show up in your life? And where outside of business, how did that first show up? Was it there with you when you were a kid? Did you have a role model who taught it to you? Tell me that story. That's what I want to know. Are you
Well,
there?
first of all, thanks very much, because what I always say when people say, well, what do you actually do? I say, you there?
Yes.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Hello? Yeah, sorry. So what's interesting is I always tell people when I'm describing what I do is I'm trying to find out what matters to people, right? And how did that come about? Well, the truth is that in high school, the only subjects I was really interested in were history, both modern and ancient history. And people would go, why? I said, because history is the window into why people do things and why people think the way they do. And it could be based on, understanding the ancient Greeks, or it could be understanding, what happened in America in the 1970s that creates guys like you, because I'm going to guess we're basically around the same age because we've got the same features.
I'm
That
34.
this
What are you
stuff happened in
talking
the
about?
70s that created the Paul Ross. Oh, yeah, yeah. You've been 34 times, right? I mean, something like that, right? But so it started off with that. And things went on, and I did different courses. One of the degrees I did was political science, which I realized very early on that my interest in political science was not necessarily politics, but it was understanding the way in which people made decisions and the sociology that drove different political movements, et cetera, et cetera. But then I fell in when I was 30, and I got lucky. I spent 10 years as a children's librarian in my 20s, basically reading kids' books to kids in libraries. I went off backpacking around the world, ended up working as a butler in Rome for a year, working for a mad duke. All those experiences were all about understanding.
Pause. I'm not letting you get away with just glossing over that story. You worked as a butler in Rome, you said?
Yes.
For
Yes.
for a mad what?
Duke.
A duke? Wait. Pause the whole button on the fucking interview.
Okay.
Whoa, wait. I'm the host. I have the right to do this. A mad duke? First of all, you mean he was batshit crazy? And what?
No, he was no. It was very strange. I'd been backpacking for nearly a year, ended up in Rome. A friend of mine from university was working there, and I slept on the floor of her apartment a couple of nights. And she sort of said, "What are you going to do from here?" And well, I'd like to stay, but I'm starting to run out of dough. So she said, "Well, okay." And the next day she came back and said that through a connection through her mother, it's a long story, the connection, but she said, I've got a job for you. And she took me around to meet this guy who was the Duke. And he basically needed somebody to take care of him in the apartment. He had his nephew, who was the heir to his title, was living with him, a 14-year-old kid. And I had to take care of the kid. And it was interesting because, well, first of all, he was a duke, right? He was also a total recluse. So for those of your audience that know Central Rome, he owned one of the blocks on the Via Condotti. The Via Condotti is one of the most famous shopping streets in Central Rome. Wow. And he owned a whole block. They're all 5-story buildings in Central Rome.
Wow, he had some major dinero in his pocket.
Well, his family, yeah, historically, yeah. So, but the bottom floor was luxury shops and a tiny little boutique restaurant. The top 3 floors he'd rented out, but the first floor was his 22-room apartment. And he literally never left the apartment. He went out in the morning at dawn to go and buy the early morning papers. And the only other time he ever went out was once a week. He would go to the boutique restaurant downstairs, and he had a table which was reserved all the time for him. So he could turn up any time. It was a table with one chair, and he went down there maybe once, maybe twice a week for lunch. The rest of the time, he never left the apartment. Right?
What a story.
Yeah. So that was, it was really interesting. It was made even more bizarre because of the circumstances of his nephew, who, as I said, was his heir, was half Italian, half Samoan. And it was a 14-year-old who looked like he was a big guy for 14, right? And part of my job was to keep the half Samoan nephew entertained, because the Duke didn't want him there. So it'd become every weekend, like in the winter, it'd be, so Dave, do you know how to ski? Oh yeah, a little bit. Here's some money. Take John skiing for the weekend to get him out of the house. Do you like football? Yeah. Do you know Maradona? Ever heard of Maradona? At the time, the world's most famous footballer. Yeah, he plays in Naples. Yeah, I know that. He goes, here, take some money. I booked your tickets to go see him down in Naples, right? And play on the weekend. So it was great for me because he was paying me to do all this stuff with the nephew, right? But to your earlier question, that experience was part of me finding out what matters to people, because I was dealing with somebody who I come from a very working class Australian background. So suddenly to be dealing with that sort of person was a totally different experience, and trying to interpret what did he want, right? Because because it wasn't like he was the type of guy who would give you a list of things to do. It was basically had to half guess what he wanted done, or what do you want me to do with the nephew, et cetera, et cetera. And then you had the clash of cultures because the nephew had been born and raised in Samoa. So he thought of himself as a Samoan who just happened to have an Italian uncle, right? So, it's dealing with two totally different cultures and the living environment. So those things all add up and give you sort of life experiences, right?
Let's move on to something that really got my attention, which is you call your company Bibliosexual.
That's it.
Well, literally that means a book, someone who's sexually aroused by books or libraries. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Now we're going to take a kinky turn, folks. We'll be right back after this message from Celibacy Incorporated. Now, what in the world?
So years ago, when I was working in public libraries in Sydney, look, the truth is when you work in public libraries and there's a lot of downtime, so you end up just reading a lot of books, right? And one day I was reading this novel and there was a character that was described as a bibliosexual. So naturally I had to look it up, right? And you're correct. In the truest sense of the word, a bibliosexual is somebody who is sexually aroused by the smell and touch of books. So the content doesn't matter. It's actually the physical aspect of the book. And there's actually science behind this because there's an enzyme in the glue in bookbinding that actually stimulates your brain, my brain, everybody that listens to this brain. But about 1 in every 200 million people, that enzyme goes into overdrive and basically you get a hard-on. Right?
Well, that's the first we've ever heard hard on the show related to wanting to fuck the book.
You told me before we started that I could use language appropriately, right?
That's I know we're not language appropriated. You want to core a hole in the center of the book and
well, no, the funny thing is they don't. See, the point is
just
in the truest sense, you could imagine a guy in the back shelves of the library just standing there with his pants around his ankles and he's got a hard on, just breathing in the air, right?
Okay, well, this has been a fascinating episode of we're going to keep going.
So,
are you a bibliosexual, sir?
Yeah. So this idea stuck with me, but then later on, when I started working in advertising, and I got exposed more and more to the theories of the way in which media works, right? And one of the things I sort of figured out fairly early on was that everybody on the planet has certain mediums that excite them or they trust or they distrust more than others. Now, I have no idea what yours are, Paul. Presumably podcasts really turn you on, right? I don't know, or only your own podcast turns you on, okay? But the truth is, and the way I always use the example is, if you think of, I don't know, what's the crappiest newspaper in the United States now? The cheapest, crappiest paper.
The New York Times, because New York just got taken over by a Islamist communist.
Okay. So let's say I write an article and it's in the New York Times, but I also write exactly the same article and it's in the Economist business magazine, right? If most people, if they see that I've written an article for the New York Post, they'll go, "Oh, it must be crap." But a lot of people would say, "Oh, if that article's in the Economist, it must be worth something."
Yeah,
that's right. So that's the way we think in terms of mediums, but we think of that way in terms of brands, goods, products, all sorts of things. It's almost impossible to find people that look at things rationally about anything. It's always emotionally based.
There's a beautiful book called Predictably Irrational.
Yeah. I know the book, right?
I'll never get him on my dinky little show, but I would love to have him on.
But that's true, right? And so the concept then is that when I talk about calling my company Bibliosexual, is my job is to help you or help any brand figure out what it is that your audience gets turned on by. And how do I make sure we build the story into that or use that to tell the story?
So it's psychology of sussing out what moves people, and then it's knowing how to weave that into storytelling. So
yes.
those are related but separate skills.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about it, all great stories are in some ways built on psychology, right? I remember going to a lecture back in the 70s in Australia and the UK. There was a very famous comedian named Dave Allen. He was Irish
I
originally.
know Dave Allen. I've seen
Yeah.
I've seen him.
You've seen his clips, right? Well, Dave Allen was like my sort of comedic hero when I was a sort of young teenager, young guy, young adult, right? I went to see him give a lecture one time, and I actually bought tickets for me and a mate of mine. What we thought we were going to see a comedy show, but it turned out actually he was actually giving a 1 hour lecture on the theory of comedy, and he didn't tell a joke. He just talked for an hour about how comedy works and what makes things funny. And what he pointed out was that it doesn't matter what the joke is. We've all heard why the chicken crossed the road, et cetera, et cetera. He said any joke in the world is actually about humans and about human fallibility. And so what you've got to do is to figure out what the fallibility is you want to talk about. And then in the case of a comedian, you've got to weave a story around that makes people laugh so they think about it. Now, if you're a dramatist and you're going to tell sad stories or very dramatic stories, you've got to do exactly the same thing, except instead of making people laugh, you want them to cry, or you want them to go, oh, that's really sad, or et cetera, right? And that the reaction you want is also part of the understanding of your audience and what are they looking for.
So you made that point beautifully. These days, you've worked with all these brands. These days, what is it that you do for clients? Are you still working in the brand creation field, or what is it that someone in my audience would reach out to you for?
I do a lot of work now with different companies, helping them figure out what the story is. So who their audience really is, what they are looking for, and then what's unique, or what is something unique about your brand, your business, that we can use as the twist in a story. So one of the problems is that a lot of brands are looking around for something differentiating and finding it hard. Then the other problem is that a lot of companies sort of have something, but then after a year or two, they go, oh, we're going to do something else. And you go, no, you don't. You just need to. If you think about some of those great brands, like we talked about Nike, right? Nike's message actually hasn't changed now for 30 years.
Just do it.
Yeah, but the way they illustrate that, it might change a bit, right? Because of different audiences, different countries, different things, right?
It's not. Hold on. I'm not being argumentative. I'm asking. It's not the check mark everywhere.
No, it is, right? Okay. The swoosh and the line is the same, but the way you illustrate that, right, might change. So as I said right earlier on, it might be the sports you use in the case of Nike. It might be different attitudes to different things. And it's the same with, L'Oreal, MasterCard, any big brand that's consistent over time. What they're doing is just adapting their core message to slightly different circumstances.
They have to be, it sounds, to use a metaphor, they have to be chameleons, not entirely, but just a little bit to fit in just a little.
Well, yeah, of course.
We've actually hit the 30-minute mark, which is as long as we go, believe it or not. But I know I stepped on you there. My audience will want to stay in touch with you, Dave. So how do they do that? How do they stay in the conversation with you?
Sure. You can find me on LinkedIn. I post a lot of stuff under David McCaughan. You can find me at David C. McCaughan at gmail.com. And you can find my website, which is just look up Bibliosexual, and you're going to find my website.
That's how people, so ladies and gentlemen, you will remember Bibliosexual.com.
Please remember that. It's hard to forget.
All right, mate. So once again, another entertaining episode of The Influencer's Edge. And as I always say, to the hostile alien armada hovering in their cloaked spaceships just outside of Earth's atmosphere, remember, eat the Canadians first. They taste better. And we'll see you on the next episode of The Influencer's Edge. Dave, stay with me for a brief green room chat. See you later, ladies and gentlemen.
The Influencer's Edge is brought to you by the Rapid Sales Accelerator. If you're ready to skyrocket your sales by 30% or more in just 90 days, then you need to claim your free training right now. You'll learn 4 words that will compel your prospects to trust you like they were children within the first 3 to 5 minutes of any conversation across any platform and any medium. You'll learn how to give your prospects objection amnesia, to crush objections like, I need to talk to my spouse, or I need more time to think it over, or it's too expensive. If you'd like to claim your free training now, go to www.paulrossbook.com. Do it before your competition does it now. Welcome to the Influencer's Edge. This is the place where you come to get the latest breakthroughs, cutting-edge insights, tools, and techniques to leapfrog over the pack in sales, persuasion, and influence. Be sure you visit our website at www.theinfluencersedge.com. And while you're there, subscribe to us via your favorite network. Now sit back, tune in, and enjoy today's episode.